from noon to 1:30 on starting this Thursday, and for subsequent Thursdays in November, except for Thanksgiving. But a chance for folks to gather together, explore some scenarios about how to use spiritual grounding while we are in the streets, taking action for our witness and for our beliefs. So if that program is of any interest to you, there's still some spaces available. We've had a number of folks join us just in the midst of my introduction here. So just to say one more time, my name is Lena Blunt. I am the education coordinator here at Pendle Hill. And I am going to introduce our speaker for tonight, Eileen Flanagan, who will then go into some silent worship, Quaker style, expectant listening. And Eileen will speak out of that silence to start her talk this evening. I'm really, really thrilled to have Eileen joining us tonight. She's an award-winning author of 3 books, including Renewable, One Woman's Search for Simplicity, Faithfulness, and Hope. She carries a minute of religious service from Chestnut Hill Meeting for her prophetic ministry of healing humanity's separation from the earth, each other, and the divine. As clerk of the Earthquaker Action Team for 5 years, she helped to develop the strategy that pressured PNC Bank to stop financing mountaintop removal coal mining and helped launch the current Power Local Green Jobs campaign. And since the 2016 election, her speeches, writing, and online teaching on spirituality grounded activism have reached thousands. You can learn more about her newest online course, Finding Your Role in This Moment of Social Change, or sign up for her newsletter on her website, which we'll be putting in the chat either now or later. And I also just want to say before we go into silence that it's such a pleasure to introduce Eileen. Also for me personally, Eileen and I met through the Earthquaker Action Team, and I've got to organize with Eileen for 9 years now. And it's just been a true blessing to grow and learn both from Eileen's leadership and with Eileen in action. So that is just a personal welcome as well. I invite folks to center into some silent worship, and Eileen will speak out of that silence.
Thank you, Lena. It's great to be here, to see so many familiar faces, to feel connected to Pendle Hill, which has played such an important role in my life, and to be introduced by Lena, who took over as co-clerk of Earthquaker Action Team, or EQUATE, and I rotated out of that job. When Lena asked me to speak the night before the election, we came up with this title that seemed really clever at the time, What Happens Wednesday? And within weeks, it became clear that there's a very good chance we won't know the election results on Wednesday. And the subtitle feels more important, preparing ourselves for the work ahead, because we know that there's work ahead, regardless of what happens with this election, as consequential as it is. So I want to acknowledge that in those last few weeks, I've joined an effort called Choose Democracy. Some of you may have been here for George Lakey's talk or taken one of his trainings that are focused on how to prevent a coup, should that happen. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that tonight, but I will reference it at a few points. And the thing that's relevant here at the beginning is to acknowledge that as we've trained around 8,500 people in the last few weeks, I've seen again and again in the chat on those webinars and the comments and the evaluations how scared people are at this moment. There's just a lot of anxiety in our country, and anxiety particularly among people who share my political perspective, who are hoping fiercely that this election will go the way that they are hoping and voting. And so I just want to acknowledge that as we begin, and also acknowledge that maybe there's other feelings in the group. Maybe there's hope, maybe there's excitement, maybe there's impatience. I'm pretty sure that that's a feeling that some people are having. All of it is welcome here tonight. I want to ground us in things that are still going to be true Wednesday as a starting place for this conversation. On Wednesday, I'm quite sure that the trees at Pendle Hill are still going to be beautiful. And they're still going to be on the traditional lands of the Lenape people, as well as my house and my Quaker meeting for worship. Even though it feels like apocalyptic times, I'm very confident that the sun is going to rise on Wednesday, Thursday, and however many days it takes to count the votes in the Philadelphia Convention Center, to resolve the 230 lawsuits that have already been filed about this election. The sun's going to keep rising, or at least that's how it's going to look to us from this planet. We know that really we're the ones who are moving on an earth that is going to continue to be necessary for our lives, for our spiritual sustenance, and an earth that is in crisis. We're still going to be living on an earth that is warmer than it was 4 years ago. I can't even keep track of all the hurricanes heading through Louisiana, where I now have friends. The wildfires and the quieter disasters of drought and famine and rising malaria rates. We're still going to have those problems to deal with. At the same time, we're grappling with the history and reality of racial injustice and seeing more and more how that system and the system that is destroying the earth are deeply intertwined. The call of Black Lives Matter in the face of police violence is very much related to climate and environmental justice issues. It's the same kind of logic that leads us to allow oil refineries close to houses in Black and brown communities, and gas plants, and fracking wastewater and coal ash. And so as much as we are looking forward to the election being over, the challenges we're facing are very far from over. And so it's a moment, I think, for taking stock and reflection. So I'm really grateful to be here. The good news is that on Wednesday, we're going to wake up to a world where many more people are aware of these problems than were 4 years ago. I think we've seen an increase that has been really important in a number of ways. When I think back to 4 years ago and the day after the election, I remember the shock, the sadness, crying on some on the part of some people. And I remember my cousin, who is very conservative, posting something on Facebook that said, if your kids are crying over the election, you're a bad parent, or you failed as a parent. And this sense that from the other side, people seem to be sore losers, that this was just about losing an election. But that wasn't what it was, I think. I think a lot of people didn't want to believe that we lived in a country that would elect someone who openly bragged about grabbing women's private parts, openly expressed white supremacist views, all the things. We didn't want to believe we lived in a country that would elect someone like that, or at least many people didn't. And they posted things like, "This is not my country." And I saw this especially from white people. And I saw from many people of color responses like, "Yeah, this is your country. This is what it's been like." And so it feels like that election was like a revealing or a puncturing of illusions. I've been thinking of the metaphor of waking up. Robin DiAngelo, the author of White Fragility, kind of questions the notion of wokeness, because it sort of implies that you reach some state and then you're there. But I actually like the language around waking up, because waking up is something you have to do again and again. It's not a one time and you're done. We can doze back pretty easily. We also have different ways of waking up. I've been thinking about how I love to wake up to the birds in the morning and the sun rising gently. I don't particularly like to wake up to a fire alarm. And it feels like the 2016 election was a fire alarm for a lot of people, a kind of jolting to see things that they didn't particularly want to see. I think part of the waking up was realizing that we couldn't count on a hero to save us. I think these 4 years can't really be understood without also looking at the 8 years before them. The hopes people had in President Obama, the sense that here was a guy who was going to solve race in America. Not many people said racism is over out loud that I heard, but I think there was this sense of a hero come to save the day. And I don't think it's an accident that the Black Lives Matter movement started during the Obama era, because it became clear that we actually can't wait for politicians to solve the great crises of our time. I think in the last 4 years, to me, the most hopeful thing is watching this rise of consciousness paired with a rise of activism. The Black Lives Matter movement this summer had so many more people in the streets after George Floyd's death than after Michael Brown's. More people understanding why it was important. Even during a pandemic, it was amazing the number of people who showed up. The climate movement, millions of people in the streets with the youth leadership of the Youth Climate March, which 9 years ago when I met Lena through Quaker Action Team, I don't think we could have imagined that many millions of people around the world and thousands in Philadelphia striking, taking off school to march for the climate. The Me Too movement, the women's marches, it's been a moment of seeing more clearly what the problems are that we need to grapple with. And so come Wednesday or Thursday or Friday or a month from now, whenever we get clear on the election results, I think it's important that we remember that both of those things are true. We do live in a country that could elect someone with the views that we have. And we may or may not do it again. I'm not entirely sure. But we will still be a country that could do that. And we are also a country where many people have stepped out of their comfort zone to learn, to grow, and to work for a different kind of world. So as we begin, I'm really holding both of those things. And whichever way the election goes, I think both of them are things that we're going to have to grapple with. We're living in a country that is more violent than it was 4 years ago, or where violence at least has been normalized, where partisanship is more extreme. I don't know if people are going to be having Thanksgiving conversations this year or meeting over Zoom with their families, but the difference between people with different views, you know, we feel the strain of that, those of us who have relationships with people who vote differently. And that's not going to go away. That's not going to be solved by this election. And so holding attention to that and awareness of that is important. I continue to be encouraged by something that George Lakey said right after the 2016 election, which was that the greatest progress in the United States has come at the times of greatest polarization. And so he talked about the 30s and the 60s, which were also times where political violence was on the rise. The Klan was on the rise, but so were the forces of change, and that those were the times that we've seen some of the greatest progress. So I have a sense that that is going to continue, all of those dynamics, whether or not the election goes the way that I would like it to. The difference will be how strong the headwinds are. It's like we have a mountain to climb, and are we going to climb it in a storm, or are we going to climb it on a breezy day? But it's going to be hard either way. One more thing about reflecting on these last 4 years is that there's a lot more people who have gotten training, which is very exciting for me as someone who trains people in nonviolent direct action. But especially during these last weeks with Choose Democracy, as I said, we've had 8,500 people take webinars on how to stop a coup. But over the last years, there have been many, many groups skilling up, learning more of the history. There's been, you know, a big interest in the history of previous times of conflict and learning from that. And in my own work, the online classes that I've been teaching since the last election have had so many people willing to stretch in new ways, and I find that really hopeful. The way those courses came about relates to something else I want to share tonight, and that is about how I feel spirit moving in these times. The morning after the election, my Quaker meeting, Chestnut Hill, has a Wednesday morning worship gathering, weekly gathering. From what I understand, a few people go to it, except for the Wednesday after the 2016 election, where there was this sudden rush of people needing community, including some people from the neighborhood who had never been to Quaker worship before, and including me, who went for the first time. And two things happened in that worship for me. One was I had had this idea 6 months earlier that I should start teaching online classes on what I had learned in working with Earthquaker Action Team about nonviolent direct action, about thinking about strategy, about activism with a spiritual component. So I had this idea in the back of my head and no time to work on it. And in worship that morning, this very clear voice said, "It's time for that online class." And even though I had never offered anything over Zoom before and didn't know how to put a form or a PayPal on my website, it just felt clear that I needed to learn how to do those things. And just from a Facebook post, I think I had like 180 people in that first class, because there was such a hunger to learn, to meet this. It was called We Were Made for This Moment, that first class. And I still feel some of the energy of that time now, of people wanting to lean in and to meet the moment that we're in. And I find that very encouraging. The other thing that happened that morning in worship was a song came to me, a song that I had learned a few years earlier and always loved, but it's sort of been my mantra for the last 4 years. And the first verse and chorus go like this.
There is a hurting in my family. There is a sorrow in my town. There is panic in the nation. There is a wailing the whole world round. I am open and I am willing. To be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors those who go before us. So lift me up to the light of change.
Thank you, Lena. So one of the things I've learned to really trust in the last 4 years is that I'll be given what I need. And today I was preparing for this talk. I was thinking of that song, thinking that I have sung it in person when led, and I sing much better when I'm led and really not well when I'm not. And I was too nervous to sing it over Zoom. And here my friend Lena posted herself singing that very song on Facebook this afternoon. So we took it as a sign. But seriously, I have had that experience of this time and of looking back and feeling that spirit, the divine, God, the universe, whatever you call it, I'm not at all attached to what people call it, but I do believe there's something bigger than us at work. And I believe that it takes the long view way more than I do. And so when I think about that moment in late 2016, where I felt this leading to start teaching, I look back and see all the ways I was prepared for that moment and didn't realize it at the time. So 2 Pendle Hill teachers, Marcel Martin and Doug Gwen, had both asked me to be guest teachers on their online classes. So I had at least been on a Zoom call way ahead of some of you probably. But more importantly, I went to the last couple of days of the Paris Climate Summit, and I kind of expected to have this big, like, meeting people from around the world, feeling part of a global movement, inspiring experience. And I kind of did. It was nice. It was nice to meet people and to be there on the final day and march with people to the Eiffel Tower. But what really came out of that trip was something I didn't expect, which was a very strong sense that things were going to get rockier in our world and that I should be focusing on my spiritual practices. The message of that trip was, get grounded, girl, because it's going to get wild. This was December 2015. I had no idea what that would mean. But I think it's one of the reasons I wasn't as shocked when Trump was elected or any of the things that have happened since, because I've had this sense for a while that we are preparing for a difficult time. There have been lots of other times in the last few years. I'll just give a couple of quick examples. I'm working on a book now on the intersection of climate and race and spirituality. And it's the hardest book I've ever written because it's about how everything is connected. It's called The Illusion of Separation. But I continue to be given the support I need to write that, including my fabulous support committee in my meeting, who's on this call. I have often had the experience of being given the person I needed to meet. So I was in Louisiana doing some research at LSU. I stepped outside and I go to make a phone call and I hear two people behind me talking about Quakers at Louisiana State University. Like, what are the odds? So I turn around, I start talking to them. I had been at a point in my research where I had met a lot of people who lived on the front lines of the fossil fuel industry, who had high rates of cancer and all kinds of health problems, and was feeling this real anger myself at the fossil fuel industry, and had this sense of like, I just need to talk to people who work for industry, not to get the other side, but to hear their experiences, to have a fuller picture, of the truth of what was happening in this region. And so when I connected with these Quakers, I said, oh, I'm looking for someone who's worked for Exxon, which is huge in Baton Rouge. And sure enough, they were like, oh yeah, so-and-so's husband. And so here this guy who worked for Exxon for 30 years took me around and gave me a perspective I could not have found if I went looking for it. He talked about his experiences working at Exxon, but also his experiences as a white man who grew up in Mississippi, who had gradually had his own racial attitudes changed, and who shared some of the dynamics of working inside Exxon and how that had changed over the years. So I just feel like this time, whenever I step into something difficult, I'm given what I need, which is not the same as saying that things are easy, but feeling grateful for that and feeling a sense of trust that whatever comes out of this election, that the same will be true, that it might be very, very difficult, but if we lean into following how we're called, that we will be given what we need. That also goes for difficult experiences. Just this week, I've been working with Choose Democracy. I did my first webinar last night, and I was looking for a story to fill a particular niche, to teach a particular lesson. And I suddenly remembered this horrible experience from 4 years ago, early in the Trump years, where there was a huge march in Philadelphia, and I was asked to be a marshal or peacekeeper, and really struggled to play that role in the face of a conflict that was happening, and felt like a failure. Although I ultimately figured it out, I focused a lot on the parts that I did wrong in the beginning. And 4 years later, I realized that is the perfect story for this training. And so again, spirit with the long view, the thing that I didn't want to happen ended up being something that taught me really important lessons. So we're going to transition into small groups in just a moment. Lena's going to put up a query, and Francisco is going to put people in small groups. But I want you to take a moment now and pause and reflect on what have you learned in the last 4 years. And it could be about the world. I don't know why I capitalized the world. It could be about the world, spirit, or yourself that you want to remember during the next 4 years. So again, in this spirit of whatever is happening, what is it that you have learned that you want to hold on to? And I believe that Francisco is going to put you in groups of 4, and you'll have 12 minutes, which means that assuming everyone comes into your group, you will have 3 minutes each. If one person runs to the bathroom or something, you will have 4 minutes each. Obviously, if you have 2 people on a couch, figure it out. Is there anything else that people need to know before they go and do this exercise?
Just a reminder that on the corner of their screen, they will see a 10-minute clock. And when these 10 minutes are over, they don't need to worry. They will have the other remaining 2 minutes, and we will prompt them about that.
Great. And could we also maybe put the query in the chat? People may not realize that when you go into breakout rooms, the chat disappears, but you can click chat and get it back. That's actually the second, that's the second set of queries that is on the
Oh,
screen.
I'm sorry, I clicked. I'll go back one slide. A question came up, Eileen. Is this worship sharing in groups confidential?
That would be my assumption. If you have a particular concern, I would suggest that you say that to your group. And we're trusting that you'll manage yourself to divide the time in an equitable way.
Thank you.
So here we go. Please accept the group invitation when you receive the prompt on your screen.
I bailed on my group.
Yeah, I hope that I don't. Lina is back. Hey, Lina, did you manage to put the query on the chat?
In the chat? No.
Well, if you can put
Sorry
it,
for
I can.
What was that?
I said sorry for springing that on you.
No, that's okay. I can broadcast it to them. Or Francisco, do you want to broadcast it?
Yeah, put it on the chat, and I also can try to.
Okay. I think only the folks in the main room can see the chat that I just sent.
Let's see here.
Lena, I just mentioned if once they're in the room, if they press chat, they'll see it again. They might not remember that I just said that, but.
Okay. Thanks, Francisco.
Yeah, thanks to you. Let me put this person in room 4.
Emily, if you're with us, you should have an invitation to join a breakout room.
I
Moved her.
I already moved it.
Nice. That's good. That sounds good.
I enjoy the power of being the host.
There you go. How are you feeling?
Good, good. I am monitoring here the.
We had so many people register late, and a couple folks messaged me asking for the link, but I sent it to them, but Are we still live on YouTube? Friends on YouTube, they're in small groups at the moment. If you want to reflect on the queries, I'll share the screen again.
Lena, the chat is open to anyone, right?
They can only chat to me and Francisco.
Could we change that? I was going to do a participatory thing. It's not a big deal, but would you mind for a specific exercise?
I think it's okay for a specific exercise, and then we'll just close it afterward.
Okay.
Does that work for you, Francisco?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I just changed it. Friends, if you're watching from YouTube, we have folks in small groups discussing this query. You can take some time to journal or reflect yourself on this question. What have you learned in the past 4 years about the world, spirit, or yourself that you want to remember during the next 4?
Hello to Alan, who just joined us. We have people in small groups responding to the query that's on the screen. I'm not sure how many more minutes we have left, but you might want to just consider it for yourself until we're ready to come back together.
Welcome, Marcel. Folks are reflecting on this query in small groups, and then we'll come back to the large group in just a moment. Hello, Diana. We are here reflecting on this question. There are folks in small groups, and we will come back to the large group in just a moment. So thanks for your patience and for joining us. For friends who are joining us via YouTube, we have small groups who are considering this query. What have you learned in the past 4 years about the world, spirit, or yourself that you want to remember during the next 4? Our small groups will be ending in just about a minute or so, and then we'll continue in the large group. But if you want to reflect on this question, we invite you to. Welcome everyone who is with us. Folks are reflecting on this question in small groups, and then we'll return back to the large group in just a moment.
Lena, I'm going to invite people, if they want to just put a few words in the chat about their answer, and we'll see what that does to the chat. I'm not going to try and read all of them out loud, but I may pick a few to read. And oh, did you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Eileen. I just to say for folks who were on here earlier, you heard us say we set the chat so that you could only chat to me and Francisco. We've changed those settings for these queries so that when Eileen asks for your answers, you can write in the chat and everyone will see them. So we are opening the chat up for that purpose.
Yeah, I was just going to say it when people come back. And I was, if there are a lot of answers and you want to help me track them, that would be great.
Sounds good. Welcome back, friends. Eileen, I believe folks are returned from their small groups. If you want to repeat your query.
Sure, great. Welcome back, everyone. We are mostly keeping the chat closed during this presentation, but we are opening it for a little bit now. And I see someone's already a few people have put in answers. If you want to share a few words of some of the things you've learned over these 4 years, No pressure, but if you want to share that with a group, we'll just take a minute to harvest some of the wisdom of this community. And I'm just going to read a few. I think I won't be able to keep up. Yeah, that the psyche of the nation is affected by what the leader says. Less overall control, so must do what I can and not think it too small. Listening, hearing, questioning, learning new behaviors. Simplicity, community, and mindfulness. I survived and will survive. The world is both more fragile and more resilient than I thought. Are there any jumping out to you, Lena?
Yes, I'm seeing the importance of collectiveness, all of us in here together, and the long haul view, and holding hope to do the work that we're capable to do. Even when we feel so alone, we are not alone.
Yeah, I saw someone, I've lost it now, but about taking action as part of a group and being part of a collective.
Mm-hmm. Someone said that previously they realized their faith was in humanity, not in spirit, and how over these 4 years that has shifted.
Ellen says, this is our time to be changed as we help change happen. Thank you, everyone. Let's leave that open another few minutes if people want to continue to share and learn from one another. I'm going to shift a little bit to talk about the work of Choose Democracy and some of what I'm learning from that. And I'm curious, in this group of 148 people, I'm imagining that there might be some people who either heard George Lakey's Pendle Hill talk last month or took the Choose Democracy training with George, or last night with myself. And it's totally fine if you didn't, but if you did, I'm gonna quiz you a little bit. I'm curious if people remember what the 4 keys to stopping a coup are. So if anyone, Ruth took the first one. So that was several weeks ago, but if anyone remembers the 4 keys, go ahead and put them in the chat. Basically, as George Lakey, who many of you know, is a Quaker who turned 83 today, a mentor of mine and a friend, George started paying attention to the things that Donald Trump was saying about possibly not respecting the election results, and started getting concerned that this is a person who might not willingly leave office. And he might try and use the power of the presidency to grab onto power in any number of undemocratic ways. And so George started reading the history of coups around the world and basically mining from them some key lessons that we could apply in our situation. I'm not going into all those historic stories. If you're interested in the training, choosedemocracy.us. We have at least one more scheduled and more if needed. But in essence, the 4 keys that seem to run across successful attempts to thwart a coup nonviolently were, and let's see, did anybody get them? Practice nonviolence, yes, great. Nonviolent discipline is one of them. That when people go up against, a powerful government, they are way more likely to be successful if they are nonviolent. And in the event that they experience violence, staying nonviolent only illustrates the difference between the democratic forces and the anti-democratic forces. Alliance building, yes, alliance building was another. Very often in social change struggles, we're focused on, this side and that side. But one of the things they found in thwarting coups is that appealing to the center the people who don't have yard signs up, the institutions that are very important to running a society but may not weigh in partisan fights, those institutions became incredibly important. And the people who were seen as the center, it can't just be left versus right. What the center does is really important in that kind of situation. Widespread mobilization, that's right. Mass participation was really, really important. If there is a undemocratic power grab, which we're calling a coup, it's a moment where really reaching beyond the usual suspects and having widespread participation makes a huge, huge difference. And great. So I see 3 out of the 4. The fourth one is the one that people find most difficult, and that is refusal to accept illegitimate authority. That can look different ways. There's one coup story where government workers didn't come in, and so the person trying to take power couldn't issue a press release saying that he was in charge because there were no secretaries. I think this was 1920 Germany, and Wolfgang Kopp didn't know how to type, and so he had to bring his daughter in to type the proclamation that he was now in charge. And basically, with no one willing to cooperate with his government, it didn't last very long. There's lots of ways that people can resist illegitimate authority, but that is the one that people find stickiest, and it's also the one that, frankly, is the most strategic in looking at our situation. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time speculating about what's going to happen coming out of this election. But I think the conversations around what if there were a coup actually illuminate some other things that we need to grapple with in order to deal with any of the other issues that I mentioned at the beginning are still going to be true on Wednesday, no matter what. So this idea of refusing to recognize illegitimate authority, I think is very, very Quaker. Not everyone here is a Quaker, but I know many are. For those who don't know, Quakers were founded in 17th century England at a time of political upheaval. And they had this radical notion that every person could connect to God directly, that they didn't need a priest, that they could hear the teaching directly themselves, even women, even Black people, even Muslims, even indigenous people. It was a pretty radical idea. Quakers didn't, and still don't, always live up to that principle of radically seeing that of God in every person, but it is something in our tradition that we are proud to have had that insight very early on. The way people lived that out was often resisting the Church of England. People refused to pay tithes to the church because it wasn't their church, and they felt it was illegitimate for the crown to force them to pay tithes to the Church of England. That was massive civil disobedience, actually. Thousands of early Friends went to jail, and hundreds died in jail for that principle. As I was thinking about the old Quaker practice of refusing to stand for a judge, I don't think it was described in that way of not recognizing illegitimate authority, but there was something in it of saying our authority comes from beyond this court, beyond the structures of this society, and what we recognize as authority is more than human rank. There were all kinds of things Quakers did to get in trouble, like refusing to take off their hat to someone who outranked them socially. And so I've been thinking of those stories during this time when in these trainings people are grappling with, well, what would it look like in our country today to refuse to recognize illegitimate authority? Many unions are talking about striking. There's actually AFL-CIO federations around the country grappling with this. Some have decided that they're open to some kind of general strike. The teachers union seems to be down with that. The flight attendants are talking about rolling strikes, and if flight attendants aren't on the plane doesn't take off. It's an extraordinary moment that people are saying ahead of time, we won't go along with this if we see an undemocratic power grab. What I've been thinking about is what can we learn during this time that will help us navigate the mess that is to come if there is an unclear election result, or in a clear result either way. Because it seems to me that to deal with the problems that I mentioned at the beginning, climate change, racial justice, sexism, and a whole host of others, we're at a point where we need to really stop going along with business as usual, or we won't be able to make the changes that are needed, particularly in any kind of time frame, which is an issue for climate change. The other issues are urgent, but climate change, because of feedback loops, actually has a deadline to avoid really catastrophic losses. We need to be acting within this decade. And so what are the lessons that we can learn, both in thinking about coups and thinking about early friends? And one of the things that I've come up against in speaking to Quakers is a surprising aversion to the word strategy, and an aversion to talking about risk. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about both of those things. A few years ago, maybe 4 or 5, I'm not sure, I went and gave a talk to a group of Quakers somewhere, and only a little part of my talk was about strategy, but I was asked to write some queries. And so most of them were, you know, I don't know, reflections of different kinds, but one was specifically about strategy because I wanted people to think about that. And then when I was getting ready to give the talk, I found out that the person from the Worship and Ministry Committee had rewritten my query. And for the non-Quakers, this is like a reflection question. She rewrote my query about strategy to say something like, "Are friends faithful to the leadings of love?" And I was like, okay, that's not at all the question that I asked. Why would you rewrite a question about strategy? And I actually was really grateful for that incident, because it clarified for me that we have this muddled idea that it's somehow not spiritual to use logic to learn from history. And that's not true of any other realm that I can think of. Early friends were perfectly happy to learn about good agricultural practices, or Quaker educators to learn about education, or theories on how to do anything really. But for some reason in this realm of social justice, social witness, we kind of have this idea that we just need to show how we feel, and that's being faithful, and that we don't actually have to think about what will make an impact. I don't think that was true of the early Quakers. Doug Gwen said this actually when I visited his Pendle Hill class years ago. I was talking about the work of Earth Quaker Action Team, which was such a breath of fresh air to me after years of going to silent vigils and big protests that didn't stop any of the wars I was protesting, to learn the fact that you could think strategically about how to apply pressure on a decision maker, and that in that way, a relatively small group of people could make a relatively big impact. It was so exciting to do that with a group that also had Quaker values and spiritual grounding and singing, and that these weren't contradictions. And I gave this talk on this idea of the pillars of power, which is part of the Choose Democracy training. The idea that any power holder is really supported by different institutions, whether it's the military or the business community or the press or things like that, that if those institutions turn on the power holder, they're not going to be able to stay in power. We use that theory in Earth Quaker Action Team to think about how to make a difference on climate change. Our first campaign was against a bank because we realized that banks were a major pillar holding up the fossil fuel industry. And if we can get the financing out, that will make a big difference. It's actually easier to pressure a bank than it is a fossil fuel company. Banks actually care what their customers think. And so that way of thinking about activism was really life-changing for me. It was much more empowering, much more encouraging than the silent vigil that didn't stop the war, which was meaningful to be with other people, but ultimately left me feeling more despair. So when I gave this presentation in Doug Gwen's class talking about the pillars of power, he said afterward, I actually think that the early Friends had a similar kind of strategy and that they were more strategic than people think. And Doug Gwen, for anyone who doesn't know, is a Quaker historian who's written quite a lot about early Friends. And I said, really, that's fascinating. And as he explained to me the anti-tithing campaign, it really sounded like a Pillars of Power campaign. It's pretty hard to take down the monarchy if you're just a small group of radical religious people, but the Church of England was a pillar holding up the monarchy. And by withdrawing their consent and saying that they would refuse to cooperate with these institutions, it was a way for them to resist the status quo and live out their values. They didn't succeed in taking down the Church of England by any means, but they did succeed in winning more liberal religious liberty laws ultimately in England. And likewise in the United States, Mary Dyer played a role. And this morning I felt led to come to worship at Pendle Hill on Zoom, which I had not done before. And here there was a message about Mary Dyer, which was interesting because I was thinking of the question of risk in making change. And someone told the story of Mary Dyer, who was a Quaker in New England in the 1600s. She was hung, and I had always heard that she was hung for being a Quaker. After hearing the message in meeting, I Googled Mary Dyer to learn a little more. And I just want to read a few lines from this wonderful site I found, which is the top 10 things you may not know about Mary Dyer by someone named Christy Robinson. And number 10, it's in reverse order. Number 10 was that Mary Dyer's death brought you your constitutional freedom. And it tells the story connecting her, her witness, her willingness to risk her life to practice her faith, actually pushed and had a direct bearing on the Rhode Island Charter of 1663, which granted liberty of conscience or religious freedom, and eventually had an impact on the US Constitution's Bill of Rights. The next point is that Mary Dyer was hanged, but not for being a Quaker. And it goes on to explain that Quakers were persecuted in Massachusetts, but that what Mary Dyer was doing was essentially civil disobedience. She was told, you cannot preach, and she preached. She was told repeatedly, and she knew the consequences of continuing, but felt so strongly led to defy what seemed to be an unjust law that she continued. I read on in the story that one of the things they did before they got around to hanging her was they lied about her. She had 8 children, 6 of whom lived to adulthood, but one was stillborn with some medical conditions. And so her opponents and detractors made up the story that she had given birth to like a devil baby with horns, and that women who preached would not be able to have children. They would give birth to devil babies. And even women who listened to women preaching could have this happen to them. And that really struck me, because one of the things that I see is that when people fight back against injustice, it's very common for people to make up lies about them. And I think we're seeing that now in a lot of misinformation about the Black Lives Matter movement. And it's just a reminder to me that when I hear stories about someone who is speaking truth to power or acting bravely, to be wary of what else I hear about them. So one other thing about Mary Dyer is that Mary had a very specific leading. She kind of knew exactly what she thought God wanted her to do. My observation is that sometimes people get leadings like that, and I've had little ones like go to worship today. The intuition that led me to go to the Philadelphia Flower Show several years ago was what brought me to Earth Quaker Action Team. I had this strong sense I needed to go to the flower show, and it turned out that Equate was doing a nonviolent direct action there. So I've had that experience, but I think it's also probably more common that people have a different experience, which is feeling under the weight of a concern, feeling like I need to do something about an issue, but I don't know what that is. I'm not sure what to do. And so where I come out on the strategy versus leading question is that if you have a sense of spirit that is leading you to do something specific, I say do it, even if it doesn't make sense. If you have really listened carefully, if you've gotten spiritual support, if you're not sure, from a clearness committee or something like that, I think there are many stories of people doing things that have made a much bigger impact than you would have predicted by thinking logically, such as Mary Dyer. But I think for those many more cases of I want to do something and I don't know what, why not turn to history? Why not look to people who have been studying for a long time what can be effective and apply those things? I think for some reason among Quakers, we've been sort of reluctant in past eras to do that. And I feel like we're at a moment of shift where people are realizing it's not just enough to show up on the street corner with a sign. We actually need to be galvanizing all of our gifts to make a difference if what we really care about is the impact of the systems that we're working against. The thing about that is that very often the strategic choice is more risky. The symbolic action, the standing on the street with a sign, which I have done many, many times, so I am not criticizing anyone, but I've learned the limitation of that. It really gives me a sense of being in community with other people. It gives me a sense that I did something without actually pressuring decision makers, without actually impacting the pillars of power that hold up, whether it's the war or any other destructive system that we're against. And the reason that the strategic action is often more risky is if you succeed in pressuring the powerful, they don't like it and they'll push back, whether it's making things up about you or increasing the risk. We're living in a time when I know people who have been charged or threatened with much higher jail sentences, much higher than they would have gotten years ago, for things that I could imagine doing myself. And it's very, very sobering. And part of that is our current Attorney General, who we hope won't be in office too much longer. But it's not just that. After Standing Rock, states passed restrictive rules about protesting on pipeline sites. There are multiple states that have really cracked down on protesters around climate change issues because they see the growing movement, because they see the pressure, and they see people willing to step up and take risk. And so in many cases, they're increasing the consequences. One of the things I've noticed is that we don't talk frankly sometimes about risk, both in my Quaker circles and in my activist circles. Or we talk about it in ways that I find kind of muddling. Sometimes we minimize the risk, or sometimes we sort of exaggerate it. And I don't find either of those helpful. And so I would like to propose that we start talking frankly about what will it take to reverse the climate crisis, or not even reverse, slow. What would it take to slow the climate crisis? I think it takes more people risking jail time, risking encounters with police, risking their jobs, maybe in some cases. Partly, I think this is coming up now during the time of COVID, because a lot of the things that we did before suddenly become life or death issues in a way that we didn't see them as. I think for people in many countries, they know that standing up to institutions can be deadly. Environmental activists around the world are killed at horrific rates, especially in places like Brazil. In many countries, it's really downright dangerous to complain about the deforestation or to stand up to the oil industry. And in the United States, most of us have managed without having to ask that serious question of how much risk am I willing to take? COVID ups the ante, and the flagrant increase in police violence ups the ante. And the Proud Boys up the ante. So as we get ready for this post-election period, that's one of the biggest fears that I hear on the webinars from people who are afraid that people with guns will just show up. And what do we do about that? And they're serious issues. I don't want to make light of them, but I also don't want us to be paralyzed by them. I think there's a few things that have made it harder for us to assess risk in ways that I think are helpful. And one is that we're so individually oriented. We only think about the risk to me instead of the risk to community if we don't take the risk. We tend to think short term instead of thinking long term. And so I've been thinking about other historical periods and how it was risky to stand up to the Nazis in the 1920s, but not as risky as it was later, you know. Thinking about climate change and the risk of really taking on the fossil fuel industry seems so daunting right now, but not as daunting as reading the scientific predictions of what's going to happen if we don't. I feel like, excuse me, in both my activist circles and in my Quaker circles, we haven't figured out how to talk about this and how to support one another to follow, in a Quaker language, you know, to follow what we're led to do, but to also hold space for each other to do harder things. I don't believe in guilting anybody into doing anything that is not their leading, but I also think that we've kind of bent the opposite direction of saying that kind of anything is leading, right? And not really pushing each other to listen deeply for what we're called to do, what we're willing to do. I mentioned this tonight, thinking about several years ago, I gave a talk to a group of Quakers, and someone was setting me up ahead of time for the talk. And she said, well, we want you to inspire us, but we don't want you to ask us to do anything too hard. And then after she said it, I think she knew it came out a little funny. And she said, well, most of us are over 50 and have bad knees. And I kind of gently said, yeah, I'm over 50 and I have bad knees too. So I have a question about how we can be compassionate with each other while also challenging each other. I think it's a question for communities to grapple with. It's true that not everyone is meant for every job. But it's also true that talking about risk will open up more opportunities. So something that Lena's been talking about that I really learned from her experience this summer of being in some risky situations is the need for community support. And I encourage people to take the salons that Lena's offering that were mentioned at the beginning, because I think we really have to grapple with if we have an easy election and the most liberal president and Congress and Senate we can imagine, we still have a hard fight to get a Green New Deal passed, and we still have a lot of work to do in such an extremely polarized country. So even in what I would consider the best case scenario election-wise, it's not a simple, easy road. And all the other scenarios, the headwinds just get stronger and stronger. So in terms of thinking about some people willing to take bigger risks, then what are the ways that other people can support them, right? Whether it's jail support, whether it's spiritual support, which could be prayer or follow-up conversation. I think there are many, many ways for people with different abilities, different proclivities, different risk levels to be part of whatever moments are coming, and we'll be better able to figure out how to support one another if we can be more candid. So one suggestion I have about that is to change our language a little bit. I hear a lot of people saying, I can't do this because of COVID, or I can't do this for this reason. And without minimizing the concerns at all, I would like to suggest a language shift. Because there are things that I haven't done because of COVID. But I would like to, for myself, to start to say, I am not willing to take that COVID risk, rather than saying, I can't do that thing, right? And I'm just using COVID, but it goes for, the protests that might be scary, that the other kind of action that might be scary, the taking on more than you think that you can handle. And I think it's a small language change that could help us focus on what choices we're making, because even in the midst of big societal forces that we can't control, we have a lot of choice about where we put our energy and where we put our attention. I'm feeling like this is a pause moment, and maybe it's a moment for the rest of that song, Lena.
Beautiful. I'm just going to open up my reminders about the words. May the children see more clearly. May the elders be more wise. May the winds of change caress us, even though it burns our eyes. I am open and I am willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors
those who go before us. So lift me up to the light of change. There is hurting in my family. There is sorrow in my town. There is panic in the nation. There is wailing the whole world round. But I am open and I am willing, for to be hopeless would seem so strange. It dishonors those who go before us. So lift me up to the light of change.
Thank you, Lena. I have a few other closing remarks, but I think it would be good to move to a reflection first and then some Q&A. And rather than go back into small groups, let's just take a few minutes. If you have something to write with, if you want to journal, or if you want to just sit quietly and reflect. I'll tell the story before, as Lena puts up this question. This morning I was in a meeting with the Choose Democracy team, and my friend Daniel Hunter, we were doing a little check-in, and Daniel's one of the prime founders of this group. He said, I'm feeling very fearful, and I know that that is not a good way to make decisions. I'm feeling fearful about this election, about the possibility of a coup and what will happen. And he said, but then I realized that the reason that I'm afraid is because I feel that things that I love are threatened. People that I love, things that I love are threatened. And love is actually something I can kind of find my grounding in. I can make decisions out of a place of love that will be stronger than decisions that I make out of a place of fear. So I'd love to invite you to just take a few minutes to sit with this question, or two questions. What do you love enough to imagine taking some personal risk? And it could mean anything. That does not mean the same risk as someone else. Whatever feels like a risk for you. It could be the risk of speaking up at Thanksgiving. It could be the risk of challenging things at your workplace. It could be a risk related to a potential coup. Whatever comes up around that for you, and then to pay attention to what feelings come up when you consider this question. And let's just take a few minutes to sit with that, journal, or reflect quietly. Let's come back together. If you can wrap up, if you're writing, or turn your attention back here. Lena is going to open up the chat again if there are things people want to share. I've enjoyed reading back through some of the chat comments I didn't get to earlier. What do you love enough to imagine taking some personal risk? And what feelings come up when you consider this question? Feel free to go ahead and put something in the chat if you feel moved to do so. Children and grandchildren. And sorry, I just read that and it was sent to me privately. I'm not sure if that was an accident. I'm going to guess it was. If it was on purpose, I'm sorry. But if you want to share your thoughts with the group, make sure it says everyone in the chat. My family and friends and the earth we all depend on. Justice. I'd like the opportunity to stand between a bully and a victim, even if it's police. I hope not to be a coward. Children and grandchildren. Are there feelings that people want to share that's coming up tonight, both from my message and from the moment that we're in? Voting. Oh, and now they're too fast for me to keep up with. What will the world be in 10, 20, 50 years? Can we have enough for all? Someone's acknowledging their tears and their fear. I want to honor that. A strange mixture of hope and anxiety. Fierceness. Curiosity. Someone's naming financial risk as well as physical risk. Yeah, absolutely. Great, thank you. And there's more in here that I haven't reached. I think what I'd like to do is open up. We're going to have around 15 minutes, I think, of Q&A, and then we'll move toward closing after that. So Lena or Francisco, do you want to explain how Q&A is going to work?
Sure. Folks who've been on First Monday lectures before, you may know that the way that we do question and answers is we close the chat again so that you can send questions to only Francisco and Eileen and myself. And then Francisco and I will read the questions out loud. We do that because we have over 100 people on this call and we know we can't answer every question. And so when we see that there are multiple questions on the same tone, that indicates to us, okay, let's lift up this question. Multiple people have this question. And it also allows us to make some choice if a question's already been answered, not to repeat it using the time that's limited. So we've closed the chat again, so you can just send your questions to Francisco, Eileen, and myself, and we'll be reading them out loud for Eileen to respond to. So welcome questions in the chat.
Questions about things I've said are particularly welcome. I don't have a crystal ball over here if you're tempted to ask that kind of question.
Mm-hmm. Eileen, I have a question about what you've learned about what supports you to take risks.
Thank you. Absolutely community, prayer, and nature, I would say are the big three. I mentioned earlier, my spiritual support committee, I think has been great, both having people who are really busy and have agreed to come once a month to sit with me, is incredible and feels so supportive. But they also ask hard questions like, oh, do you think you're dodging that thing? Which can be really, really useful. So that, for me, nature, the woods in particular, have always been one of the places that I feel spirit most. And so I know that if I'm going to do something scary, and scary isn't just civil disobedience, actually, that is less scary to me because I always do it in a group. And one of the things I've learned about myself is I can do almost anything in a group. It's the things by myself that are scary. So my first online class with 180 people was really scary, and scary that I'm going to screw something up, which I did. I tried to play a song and didn't understand that my headphones in meant that no one could hear it. And so like people watched me for like 5 minutes go like this. Sometimes our fears are out of proportion to the consequences of the thing that we're scared of, is part of what I've learned. And community, Quaker spiritual practices, queries, journaling help me get the things in proportion. So meeting for worship is really, really important and has been harder for me during this COVID time. I really don't love worshiping over Zoom, I gotta say. It's nice to see all your faces, but it's not the same for me. And so our meeting has resumed a very spaced out outdoor worship, which has been really good.
There's a question of how can we bring prayer, sit down prayer, into the streets or places that we're pressuring. And I need allies to use prayer, I believe, is a commentary on that question.
Oh, interesting. Well, I'm thinking of a story, an experience I had with Lena, actually, which was an experience of community. So maybe there's two parts to that question. We were part of a civil disobedience action around the Keystone XL pipeline in front of the federal building in Philadelphia. We had like 200 people, 40 who were risking arrest. And we had divided the group into what's called affinity groups. So many people are willing to take this kind of risk more if they're with people who they know. And many of our Jewish friends in Philadelphia were part of this action. And so we had a Jewish group at one door and a Quaker group at another door. And the police came for the Quakers first because I think we looked more quiet or something. And long story short, they began arresting people, but there was a lot of confusion. There were a lot of different kinds of police there. And we had been singing for a really long time. Lena was actually the song leader, and we were singing Woke Up This Morning with My Mind, Stayed on Freedom, like all afternoon. And, and I just had this sense of like, we need some silent worship. And so I whispered to Lena, who was next to me, and she's like, yeah, great, you set it up. So I just called for some time of silent prayer. And I acknowledged that some people were Quakers and this was normal for them, but many people weren't. But we wanted to take some time during the action to reflect on why we were there. And I can't remember what all I said, but it was sort of like, if you pray, pray. If you don't, think about why are we here? The children and grandchildren who we're concerned about, including the children and grandchildren of the police. And I said, let's just have a period of silence. And what was wild about it was this wave of silence moved across the crowd. So we heard later from people who were at the back who couldn't hear me, but they could hear the silence come. And it totally shifted the energy of the group. I had my eyes closed, but I heard one of the policemen go and turn off the police radio. And it was a profound experience of prayer with a range of people who didn't all necessarily, share my approach to silent worship. It also was really hard for the police to figure out what to do with us after that. So it's a great example to me of true spiritual grounding, also being strategic, because like, do we want to arrest people who are praying? They got confused about what to do. And it felt like a moment where we took control back of that space. If you're by yourself, you could still try it and see what happens. It might be that people respond to that, or it could be something that you do yourself to feel grounded in a scary situation. But I think that, I can't see which question this was, but one of the things George Lakey talks about in the Choose Democracy training is that around the world, people have discovered that very often sitting down makes them more safe than standing, or especially of running in the face of police. So if police are advancing on people and they all sit down to pray or kneel down to pray, there's no guarantee that they won't hurt you. But experience in many, many countries has noticed that they are less likely to hurt you when you do that. And that there's something psychologically about the running that actually increases police violence. When people start running, they run after you with big sticks and tear gas and things sometimes. Some people are also texting me privately, I'm noticing, but Lena, why don't you go ahead and see what other questions are there, and I'm gonna just scan these.
Sure. One question is, can you give some specific ideas on how to take on the pillar of power that relates to the police and the military, as well as perhaps the business community? So someone maybe who's done the Choosing Democracy training had a specific question about that.
Yeah, those are pretty different. I think the business community is the one that we're talking about really focusing on during this period, because most of us have some contact with businesses, and particularly businesses that have power. A lot of labor unions, as I said, are thinking about having rolling strikes. So I can't answer specifics about are certain kinds of businesses going to be targeted. I think there's a lot of speculation about that right now, but either because of our work or because of our consumer habits, I know I have a lot more contact with businesses than I do with the police or the military. So that's part of the reason to kind of highlight the business pillar. I think most people aren't very worried about the military in this particular situation. It seems that Trump actually alienated the military even more. I forget what month it was that he staged his photo op in DC and kind of used the military in a way he's not supposed to for his own partisan positioning. And a lot of people didn't like that. It caused tension, among military leaders. I have some friends who are veterans who say that all the officers who they know, are very critical of that kind of thing. And the tradition in the US of the military being separate from partisan politics is very seriously held. So the hope is that they would not, certainly not take the side of Trump if he tried to stay in office. And whether or not they would refuse orders is another question, but the fact that it's even seriously being debated, I think is an important sign. The police are hard, right? I think the Black Lives Matter movement has been highlighting the role of police, and I guess that's one thing I'll say. There's a concept called the Paradox of Repression, and a book by that name by Lee Smithy, who is a member of Equate and a Swarthmore professor. And the idea is that when repression occurs, it actually reveals the dynamics of the system. So the Philly police have for years, since the Republican convention, when they beat people up and got sued, they've been very proud of their civil affairs department, who comes and meets with protesters. And Equate has always had a very nonviolent experience with the Philadelphia Civil Affairs Department. It helps that Quaker's in our name. It helps that we're predominantly white. It helps that we've been around for a while and they kind of know what to expect from us. This summer, they revealed their propensity to crack down on dissent with violence. And Lena, I hope you don't mind my saying, was actually at one of the actions that was on 676, where the Philadelphia police just tear gassed people. So in terms of how to take that on, actually revealing that kind of dynamic is one of the things that takes that on. I think after that incident, there were people who always assumed that the police were on the right side, who maybe heard from people who they knew, their kids or their neighbors, that was provoked, and that a lot of the violence in Philly around protests, from what I hear from people who are witnessing it, is provoked by the police. And so one of the points George talks about is, when violence happens, to make sure you spread the word, to make sure the word gets out about who is doing the violence, and to contrast it with the behavior of the protesters, which again, you know, the small number of people breaking windows will get greatly exaggerated, while the hundreds or thousands of people who didn't do that will be minimized very often in the way that those stories are told. But emphasizing where the violence is coming from, I think, is really important.
Well, Eileen, we have more questions than we'll be able to get to tonight. Many more have been coming in as you've been speaking. I don't know if there's some coming to you directly you'd like to speak to, or if you want me to read another.
Yeah, let's do maybe one or two more. Some people sent them to me privately and then seem to send them to you too. So I'm just going to let you moderate.
Okay. One question came about this idea of alliance building. And what have you learned about where to look for allies?
Yeah, I think that we're in a time where alliance building is particularly difficult, because we're so divided. And I think that there's, I've never said this out loud, so let's see if it comes out right. I think one of the strengths of this time is the concept of intersectionality, that people working on one issue should be attentive to all the other issues. So Equate, a climate justice group that is predominantly white, really is working hard to have a racial justice frame. I think, but from the beginning, we also had a lot of female identifying people and LGBTQ members. So we haven't like really done workshops on that, but I think it's part of the ethos of the group to care about those issues, right? And we have a culture where it would be difficult to be a member or a partner or an ally if you had radically different views on those issues. I think it's something that's tricky because we're trying to, in our activist spaces, care about all the things. But then how do we build bridges with people who maybe don't care about all the things that we do? So one of the things I've learned from George over the years is that George is very utilitarian about this sort of thing. He'll say, I'm a gay man, but I don't care if you're homophobic if we have the same goal and we can work together on that goal. And I suspect that there's a generational difference there. The old union movements, I think, had much more that sense of we ally on the things we have in common, and we just don't talk about the things that we're different on. And in the coup preparation work, because one of the key strategies is to reach a broader segment of society, I do think it's going to be a challenge to current activist culture to figure out what those alliances are. But I think the union movement is a great example. A lot of the unions are very, very strong on some things and not necessarily bastions of equality. It depends on the union, right? But thinking of myself as a climate activist and thinking of unions that say represent fossil fuel workers, in most situations, I wouldn't look to them for alliances. But in this moment of coup prevention, it would be great to build alliances with groups like that, because who better to shut down the country than people who have their hand on the levers of the pipelines and all the other things that keep us going. So I think we need to think creatively about it, and to figure out how people can feel solid in their own values, that's not diminished by building alliances with people who are different. There's a great movie, Pride, that is about an alliance in England between miners and LGBT activists in the 80s. That's a very sweet story of creative alliance building.
Eileen, do you want to settle into some closing silence before your final remarks?
Yeah, let's do that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Earlier this evening, I shared about the ways that I've felt supported by Spirit over the last 4 years in particular, and the recognition that Spirit has a longer view than I have, and that things that might not make sense at the time might be preparation. And then I talked about strategy and how that doesn't need to be in conflict with listening for divine guidance. And what's coming now is a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. in his Beyond Vietnam speech, where he was really grappling with the connection between the racism that he was fighting in the United States and the war in Vietnam that he was finally coming and speaking out against, which some people had been urging him to do in the civil rights movement, and others were worried about. But in that speech, he names the triplets of racism, militarism, and materialism, and says that they all stem from a deeper malady. And I've been thinking about that phrase, the deeper malady, because I think that there's, below the pillars of power, there's this foundation. What enables us as a society to live in a way that is actually killing our planet? What enables us to live in a way that we're okay or quiet about our brothers and sisters being killed in all manners of ways, whether it's not being able to get the COVID test or police violence or the fossil fuel economy. And I guess I'll close with a pitch for nonviolent direct action as a way that I think we can work at both levels. I think nonviolent direct action is not the only way to make change, but it's the most powerful one that I have found in terms of resisting what we believe is wrong. It can exert real pressure on pillars that look too powerful to move. And in being willing to take a risk, in being willing, whether it's the jail sentence or the police or even just the fine or the time away from your family, the willingness to take a risk and the repercussions that sometimes come reveal that deeper malady in our system, reveal what's wrong with our priorities. And I think that that way of acting, the revealing the deep spiritual disconnect while pressuring the actual decision makers, is very, very powerful to me. And my hope is that this time of intensified training and learning and stretching will invite more people into this way of making change, which I think is both very much in the Quaker tradition and also very much needed in a world where systems are crumbling and a silent vigil or writing a letter isn't enough.
Thank you so very much, Eileen, for being with us tonight. And thank you all for being with us both here on Zoom and on our YouTube channel. Blessings to you all in this work. And may we continue to carry it forward. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Lena, for singing.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Eileen.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Beautiful gift.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, friends.
Greg,
See you tomorrow.
blessings.
Peace.